I remember that night like it was burned into my memory. It was late, and the streets were almost empty as Caleb, my husband, drove us back home after a friend's dinner party. He was quiet, his hands firm on the wheel, his expression distant. I didn't think much of it then, but maybe I should have noticed. Maybe I should have sensed something was wrong. The air felt thick, almost heavy, and even though we were driving in silence, I could feel a strange unease pressing down on me. I reached out, touching Caleb's hand softly, trying to ease the tension. He gave a faint, distant smile, but his focus stayed on the road ahead. And then, without any warning, the world as I knew it shattered. A pair of blinding headlights appeared out of nowhere, and before I could process what was happening, a car smashed into us. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard, a horrible mix of metal bending and glass shattering. My body was thrown against the seat, my head hitting something hard, as everything turned into a blur of spinning, screaming chaos. For a few seconds, I didn't know up from down. Pain shot through my body, sharp and unforgiving, and the taste of blood filled my mouth. I struggled to breathe, to understand what had just happened, but it was like my body was no longer mine. I could barely move, every limb feeling like it was weighed down by 1,000 pounds. And then, as if someone had hit a switch, there was silence, a deep, eerie silence, broken only by the faint hum of the engine and the sound of dripping water. I lay there, trapped in the wreckage, pain radiating from every inch of my body. It was hard to breathe, each breath sending a fresh wave of agony through my chest. Through the blur, I managed to turn my head, looking for Caleb, desperate to know he was okay, that he was there beside me. But when I saw him, my heart stopped, a new kind of pain slicing through me, one that had nothing to do with the crash. He was moving, yes, but his gaze wasn't on me. His hand wasn't reaching out to help me. Instead, he was looking in the other direction, his eyes fixed on the figure trapped in the wreckage a few feet away. Rachel. I felt my heart twist, even as the pain threatened to consume me. Rachel, his first love, the woman who had somehow always lingered in the background of our marriage, like a shadow I could never fully escape. And now, in the middle of this nightmare, she was here, and Caleb's entire focus was on her. I tried to speak, to call out his name, but my voice was a mere whisper, swallowed up by the cold, dark night around us. I tried to reach out, but my body refused to obey, weighed down by a mix of pain and disbelief. And as I lay there, struggling for every breath, I watched as Caleb stretched his hand out, inching toward her, his face twisted with worry and desperation. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice filled with a tenderness I hadn't heard in so long. A tear slipped down my cheek, mixing with the blood and sweat, a silent testament to the betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. In that instant, I understood, maybe for the first time, just how little I meant to him. Even with my life hanging by a thread, even as I lay there, broken and barely breathing, he was reaching for her. The darkness around me grew heavier, my vision blurring as my strength faded. I felt myself slipping, sinking into a cold, numb void where even the pain couldn't reach me. And as I drifted into unconsciousness, the last thing I saw was his hand, reaching out to her, leaving me to disappear into the darkness alone. When I finally opened my eyes, the world felt strange, sterile and cold. I was in a hospital room, the harsh fluorescent lights above casting a hollow glow across everything. My body was stiff, aching in ways I couldn't describe, and each small movement sent a fresh jolt of pain through me. But the ache in my body was nothing compared to the heaviness in my chest, a void that felt deeper than any physical wound. The memories hit me in pieces, blurred at first. The crash, the sounds of metal bending and glass breaking, Caleb's face, and then his voice calling out to her, not me. I forced myself to push those thoughts aside, focusing on the room around me. I was alone, the monitors and machines beeping in steady, hollow rhythms. For a moment I thought Caleb would walk in, worried and anxious, his face filled with remorse, ready to tell me he was there for me. But the minutes turned into hours, and no one came. Nurses drifted in and out, adjusting my IV, checking my vitals, their faces kind but distant, like they knew something I didn't. Finally, I gathered enough strength to ask one of them, "Has anyone come by for me?" The nurse hesitated, her eyes softening as she looked at me. "Your husband was here earlier," she said, her voice gentle. "He had to step out." Something inside me cracked a little more. He had been here, yes, but he had left. Even knowing I was here, alone and hurt, he'd chosen not to stay. The days blurred together after that, each one blending into the next as I lay there, waiting, hoping. Every time footsteps echoed down the hall, my heart would leap, only to crash when the steps continued past my door. I asked the nurses if he'd been by, and each time their answers were the same. He'll be back soon. But soon stretched on like an eternity, and with each empty hour, the weight of his absence grew heavier. One day, a nurse brought in a small bouquet of flowers. She placed them by my bed with a soft smile, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Caleb had finally realized what he'd done. Maybe this was his way of saying he was sorry. But when I reached for the card, my heart sank. The flowers weren't from him. They were from Rachel. The note was short, polite, almost casual. She wrote that she hoped I was recovering well and thanked me for holding on. I stared at the card, disbelief mingling with the deep, aching hurt that had become my constant companion. She was thanking me for surviving the crash that had nearly taken my life, a crash that had given her my husband's loyalty. It felt like a bitter, twisted joke. That evening, when Caleb finally visited, I could barely look at him. But the words I'd kept bottled up finally spilled out, sharp and cutting. "Did you let her send me flowers?" I asked, each word tasting of the bitterness I'd buried. Caleb's expression shifted, a flash of discomfort crossing his face. "She was just trying to be kind. She wanted to make sure you were okay." "Make sure I'm okay?" I repeated, the hurt rising in my chest. "Were you worried about me, Caleb? Because from where I was lying, it didn't seem like it." He sighed, glancing away, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't think you'd make it. I had to make a choice." His words, spoken so matter-of-factly, hit me like a blow. He hadn't fought to save me, he'd just chosen. And in that moment, as he stood there, unable to meet my gaze, I felt something inside me break completely. He had left me once in that car. And now he was leaving me here, in this hospital, in the one place where I needed him the most. Days passed in a blur of quiet, empty spaces, each one stretching out longer than the last. My body was healing slowly, but the pain in my heart felt raw and relentless, a wound that refused to close. I lay in that hospital bed, staring at the pale walls, feeling the loneliness settle around me like a thick fog. The nurses came and went, their faces kind, always trying to lift my spirits with gentle words and warm smiles. But even their kindness couldn't fill the hollow ache that Caleb's absence left behind. Every time I saw the clock tick past another hour, I felt the weight of his choice press down on me, heavier and heavier. In my moments of solitude, I found myself slipping into memories, snatches of our life together, of times when I had been happy, of all the little sacrifices I had made over the years to keep him close, to make our life together work. And each memory hurt more than the last, because now I could see how much I had given and how little he had returned. One afternoon, a nurse entered my room with a somber look on her face, holding a card. "This arrived for you," she said softly, placing it in my hands. I opened it slowly, hoping against hope that it was from Caleb, that he'd finally decided to reach out to show me that I still mattered to him. But as I read the note, my heart sank. It wasn't from him, it was from Rachel. Her words were simple, polite, thanking me for being strong. She even wrote that she hoped to visit soon. It was as though she had no idea of the heartbreak she'd caused me, no idea that her very presence was like a knife twisting in my chest. And the worst part? Caleb had let her do this. Let her send me a card, as if she were the one who truly cared. The next time Caleb visited, he walked in with that same distant look in his eyes. I took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of courage I had. "Did you know she sent me flowers?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Caleb looked away, his face shadowed with discomfort. "She just wanted to make sure you were okay," he mumbled, almost defensively. "She was being kind." "Kind?" I repeated, my voice rising with each word. "Caleb, she was the one you chose. You left me in that car, fighting for my life, while you reached for her. And now, you let her pretend that she cares?" He shifted, unable to meet my gaze, his hands fidgeting at his sides. I had to make a choice," he said, his voice barely audible. "She was right there, and you look like I wouldn't make it," I finished, bitterness lacing every syllable. "You didn't even give me a chance, Caleb. You just chose her." He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came. His silence was louder than anything he could have said, a confirmation of what I'd known all along. I had been an afterthought, a second option in the life we had built together. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the stranger he had become. The man who had once been my husband, my partner, had turned into someone who could leave me to die, someone who could walk away without a backward glance. When he left that day, I didn't watch him go. I let the silence close in around me, feeling the finality of it. He had made his choice, and now I had to make mine. In the days that followed, a strange kind of clarity settled over me. The loneliness was still there, raw and unyielding, but with it came an understanding that felt almost like a release. I could no longer hold on to someone who saw me as an option, someone who had made it painfully clear where his heart truly lay. For so long, I'd tried to be everything for Caleb, bending over backward to keep him happy, to make our life together feel whole. But in that hospital bed, staring at the empty doorway, I saw how much I'd sacrificed, and how little he'd given in return. One quiet evening, I asked the nurse if I could be moved to a room with a window. She looked at me with a mix of surprise and relief, as if she'd been waiting for a sign of life from me. They wheeled my bed to a room with a small window that overlooked the city. For the first time since the accident, I felt a tiny spark of something other than pain. Sitting there, watching the world go by, I realized that I was still here. I was still breathing, still alive, and maybe it was time to start choosing myself. A few days later, Caleb showed up again, this time holding a magazine under his arm. He sat in the chair across from me, flipping through it absent-mindedly, barely meeting my eyes. It was the same awkward silence that had filled every one of his visits, but this time something inside me snapped. "Caleb," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. He looked up, surprised. "I think we need some space," he blinked, clearly taken aback. "Space? What do you mean?" I need time to think, to figure things out." My voice wavered, but I pressed on. "I can't keep holding on to something that isn't real, Caleb. I need to find out who I am without you." For a moment he looked stunned, like he couldn't quite believe what I was saying. But then he nodded slowly, a flicker of something. "Maybe relief?" crossing his face. "If that's what you need," he said quietly, almost too quickly. In that instant, I knew I'd made the right decision. It hurt, more than I could put into words, but it also felt strangely liberating. For the first time, I was choosing myself, not waiting for him to come to some grand realization, not hoping he'd change. I was taking back control of my life, piece by piece. The day I was discharged from the hospital, I left with a sense of quiet determination. Caleb offered to drive me home, but I refused, knowing I needed to make this journey alone. I wanted to feel the weight of each step, to embrace the struggle and uncertainty that lay ahead. As I stepped out into the open air, the world felt vast, full of possibilities I hadn't considered in years. There was a flicker of fear, yes, but beneath it, a growing sense of strength. I had survived the accident. I had survived the betrayal. And now, I was ready to reclaim my life. The first few weeks on my own were harder than I could have imagined. My body ached constantly, a reminder of everything I'd endured, both in the crash and afterward. Simple things, like reaching for a glass of water or walking to the end of the hallway, were painful, exhausting battles. But every time I felt myself wavering, I thought about Caleb, about that empty space where his support should have been, and I found a strange strength in knowing I'd made it this far without him. Little by little, I started building routines. Every morning, I'd push myself a little more. One extra step, one more deep breath, each movement a quiet declaration that I was still here, still capable. I spent hours practicing with the physical therapist, clinging to their encouraging words as though they were lifelines. Each day, as my muscles grew stronger, my heart did too. There were days when the memories crept in, unwanted and unrelenting. I'd find myself standing in front of a mirror, wondering if I'd ever truly known the man I'd spent all those years loving. Caleb had been my anchor, my reason for so many choices, but as I looked at myself now, I realized that maybe I'd spent more time keeping him happy than making myself whole. One morning, as I struggled to walk a few steps down the hallway, I found myself pausing in front of a large window that overlooked the city. The sky was a deep shade of blue, the sun just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the streets below. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of peace, a reminder that there was a world outside my pain. The nurse who had been guiding me smiled. "You're doing so well," she said, her voice filled with genuine pride. "You're stronger than you know." I wanted to believe her, to trust that strength was something I could truly call my own. And in that moment, I made a decision. I would no longer define myself by the love Caleb had taken away. I would rebuild, piece by piece, even if it meant standing alone. Slowly, I started to fill my days with little victories. I'd go for walks in the park, soaking in the quiet beauty around me, finding solace in the laughter of children and the gentle sway of the trees. I picked up hobbies I hadn't touched in years: painting, cooking, reading, and each one felt like a tiny act of rebellion against the version of myself that had been so dependent on him. One afternoon, as I was leaving a coffee shop, I bumped into an old friend, Claire. She looked at me with surprise, her eyes widening as she took in my thinner frame, the scars that lined my arms, and the weight I carried that went beyond anything physical. "Sarah?" she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and concern. "Oh my gosh, I heard about the accident, but why didn't you reach out?" One afternoon, as I was leaving a coffee shop, I bumped into an old friend, Claire. She looked at me with surprise, her eyes widening as she took in my thinner frame, the scars that lined my arms, and the weight I carried that went beyond anything physical. "Sarah?" she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and concern. "Oh my gosh, I heard about the accident, but why didn't you reach out?" I forced a smile, shrugging slightly. "I didn't know how," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "Everything just fell apart." Claire reached out, squeezing my hand gently. "Well, I'm here now," she said firmly, her tone filled with a warmth I hadn't realized I'd been missing. "And you don't have to go through this alone." In the weeks that followed, Claire became my rock. She'd drag me out for coffee dates, encourage me to join her for painting classes, even bring over new recipes for us to try. With her by my side, the emptiness that Caleb's absence had left began to feel less daunting. I found myself laughing again, feeling moments of joy that reminded me life wasn't just pain and betrayal. Each step forward was a reminder that I was more than the love I'd lost. I was someone capable of rebuilding, of finding happiness on my own terms. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself growing stronger, not just physically, but in ways I hadn't expected. Each morning, I'd wake up with a sense of purpose, no longer burdened by the weight of Caleb's betrayal. The memories still lingered, but they no longer held the same power over me. Instead, I found myself focused on the small, steady steps that were helping me rebuild my life. One day, I decided to clear out the old boxes in my closet. They were filled with remnants of a past life I'd been too afraid to face, tucked away as though hiding them would somehow erase what had happened. But as I opened each box, sifting through the keepsakes, the photos, the letters, I felt a strange sense of detachment. Each item was a piece of a chapter that was closed, a life I'd left behind. With each item I pulled out, I felt lighter, as though I were shedding layers that no longer fit. I gathered the photos of Caleb, the letters he'd written me during our early years together, the little trinkets that had once symbolized our love. I placed them in a box, taping it shut and marking it with a single word: past. I carried the box down to the basement storage room, placing it on a shelf at the farthest corner. Standing there, surrounded by the quiet, I realized that this wasn't about erasing him from my life. It was about creating space for something new, something that was truly mine. The following morning, as I stood by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the world outside come to life, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. For the first time, the future didn't feel empty or uncertain. It felt like a blank canvas, one that I could fill with colors of my own choosing. Claire was there for me every step of the way, her unwavering support a reminder of the kind of relationships that added joy and meaning to life. She encouraged me to join her at an art workshop one evening, and though I was hesitant at first, I found myself enjoying the simplicity of it, the feel of the paintbrush, the smell of the studio, the hum of quiet conversations around us. "Sarah," "Your work is beautiful," she said, admiring the painting I'd made. "A simple landscape, nothing extraordinary, but it was mine. You should do this more often." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "Maybe I will," I replied, realizing that I had nothing holding me back anymore. The world was open, full of possibilities I hadn't considered in years. In the weeks that followed, I began filling my space with things that brought me joy. Fresh flowers on the windowsill, new books that I'd been meaning to read, small pieces of art that made me feel alive. Each item felt like a declaration, a reminder that this was my life, built by me and for me. One afternoon, I received a call from the hospital. The doctor explained that they had just completed an organ donation surgery, a heart transplant that saved a young woman's life. He sounded almost hesitant, as though he wasn't sure how to phrase what came next. "The recipient of your donation, it was Rachel," he said quietly. For a moment, the world stood still. Rachel, my husband's first love, the woman who had come between us, had my heart, literally. The irony of it all left me stunned. But as I stood there, absorbing the news, a sense of peace washed over me. I realized that it no longer mattered. Caleb's love for Rachel, her place in my past, it was all behind me now. In some strange way, the fact that she carried my heart was almost poetic. A final chapter in a story that was no longer mine to hold on to. I had given her a second chance at life, and with that, I felt the last remnants of bitterness dissolve. I had moved on. I had found my peace. In the weeks that followed, a quiet sense of freedom began to settle within me. I'd gone through the hardest parts, faced the worst kind of heartbreak, and emerged on the other side. I was no longer haunted by Caleb's absence or by the memories of the love I thought we'd shared. For the first time in years, I felt a kind of wholeness that came not from anyone else, but from within. One day, as I was sorting through a stack of old newspapers, a flyer fell to the floor. It was an ad for a local community volunteer program, looking for people to help at a center for families and children in need. Something about it caught my eye, and before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself signing up, driven by a quiet desire to do something beyond my own struggles. The first time I volunteered at the center, I was nervous, unsure of what to expect. But as soon as I walked in, a little girl with wide, curious eyes and a shy smile tugged at my sleeve. "Will you play with me?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. I knelt down beside her, smiling. "Of course," I said, feeling a warmth spread through me as I took her hand. We spent the afternoon drawing and laughing, her excitement contagious. Her laughter filled the room, breaking through the lingering walls around my heart, and in her eyes, I saw a reflection of something I'd nearly forgotten. Joy, simple and pure. As the days went by, volunteering became a regular part of my life. I found myself drawn to the people there, each one with their own story, their own battles and victories. In their presence, my pain felt smaller, less consuming. My struggles were real, yes, but they were no longer the only thing defining me. One afternoon, while helping a group of children with an art project, the center director pulled me aside. "You have a way with them," she said, her voice warm and kind. "Have you ever considered working with children?" I laughed softly, shaking my head. "I haven't, honestly," I replied. "I never thought I'd be good at this." "Well, they seem to think otherwise," she said, glancing at the children who were watching me with eager smiles. "Sometimes our purpose finds us when we least expect it." Her words stayed with me long after I left that day. For years, I had defined myself by my relationship with Caleb, by the roles I'd played as a wife, a supporter, always standing in someone else's shadow. But here, in this simple community center, I was rediscovering parts of myself I hadn't known existed. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into the work. Each day spent at the center filled me with a sense of purpose I'd longed for, a quiet, fulfilling strength that grew with every laugh, every smile, every small act of kindness. I was no longer bound by the past or weighed down by regrets. Instead, I was building something new, something that was entirely mine. One evening, as I stood on my small balcony watching the sunset cast a warm glow over the city, a thought crossed my mind, a thought that was equal parts scary and exciting. Maybe, just maybe, I could start over completely. Maybe I could dedicate myself to helping others, to bringing hope where there was none. It was a path I'd never considered, but now it felt right. That night, I drifted off to sleep with a sense of calm, a quiet realization that I was no longer bound by the person I had been. I was free, in every sense of the word. Free to explore, to give, to live on my own terms. The next morning, as I walked through the center's doors, I felt a sense of pride I hadn't known before. I wasn't here to escape my pain or to prove anything to anyone. I was here because I wanted to be, because I was finally able to give the best parts of myself without needing anything in return. In helping others, I had found myself, and in that I had found peace. The day I made the decision to step fully into this new life felt surreal. I'd spent so long tethered to a past that no longer served me, held back by memories and feelings that had once defined my entire world. But now, those feelings had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence in the woman I was becoming. Claire was waiting outside my building, her car idling as she waved me over with an enthusiastic smile. "Come on, it's your big day," she called, laughter in her voice. I climbed into the passenger seat, feeling a mixture of excitement and nerves. "I can't believe it," I said, shaking my head. "I'm really doing this." "Yes, you are," Claire replied, her voice filled with pride, "and you've earned every bit of it." We drove in comfortable silence, the city unfolding around us. Each street familiar yet somehow new, like seeing everything with fresh eyes. The world felt brighter, sharper, and I realized that for the first time in years, I was fully present in my own life, not a bystander waiting for someone else to take the lead. When we arrived at the community center, Claire parked the car, and I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Today was more than just another day of volunteering. It was my first day working as a full-time staff member. The center had offered me a position, and I'd accepted without hesitation, knowing this was where I was meant to be. As I walked through the doors, greeted by the laughter of children and the familiar, welcoming faces of the staff, I felt a warmth spread through me. This place was no longer just a refuge from the past, it was my future, a path I'd chosen for myself. Throughout the day, I found myself fully immersed in the work. I helped with activities, organized supplies, and sat with children who needed a little extra comfort. Each moment felt purposeful, each small task a reminder of how far I'd come. I was no longer defined by the heartbreak I'd endured. Instead, I was building something beautiful, something entirely my own. That evening, as I was tidying up the art room, one of the children, a little girl named Emma, ran up to me, her eyes shining with excitement. She held out a picture she'd drawn, a colorful, chaotic mix of hearts and stars. "This is for you," she said proudly, her small voice filled with sincerity. "Because you're my favorite person here." I knelt down, taking the picture with a smile that felt as warm as the sun. "Thank you, Emma. This is beautiful," I said, my heart swelling with gratitude. In that moment, I realized that I didn't need validation from anyone else, didn't need to prove my worth or hold on to the approval I'd once sought so desperately. I was enough, just as I was, and the life I was creating was enough too. Later that night, as I walked home, I took my time, savoring the quiet streets and the cool breeze. I no longer felt the need to rush, to fill the silence or the spaces in my heart with someone else's presence. I had found peace, and with it, a deep, unshakable joy. Back at my apartment, I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky. I thought of the journey I'd been on, the heartbreak, the betrayal, the days of doubt and loneliness. But all of that felt distant now, like a chapter I'd finally closed. And as I sat there, breathing in the cool night air, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time, a profound sense of freedom. The past was no longer a weight on my shoulders. It was a part of me, yes, but it was no longer something that defined me. I was free to move forward, to embrace the unknown, to live a life filled with purpose, joy, and self-respect. And with that realization, I closed my eyes, feeling a peace that went deeper than words. I was no longer the woman who had once waited for love to save her. I had saved myself,